Okay, welcome to everyone here for our accounts receivable class here this morning. It's going to be roughly 3 hours till noon today, and then I'll stick around later if anybody has any questions they want to ask about their particular setup. I am going to go pop into my Sage. I will be using the Sample Company Inc. today here for our training. You should have that on your setup. When you go open company, you should see it on your list. You may not, but you should see Sample Company Inc. on your list. And that's just a sample company that Sage comes with for you to play in and look at. I'm going to be signing in as the admin user. So the one thing with that is the admin user has access to everything. There's no security restrictions to that account. In addition, I'm going to sign in today as June 30th, 2020. So what that means is everything I do from now on is going to default to that date. So I always mention to clients that it can be beneficial to sign in with a session date other than the actual day. So for example, it might be in July and a Sage will default to sign in as July, but if you backdate that to June 30th, because you may be working on month end, right? Everything you do then will default to June 30th. So you don't have to be constantly changing the dates when you print reports or doing adjusting entries or whatever the case may be. So that is I guess the importance of the session date. Let's just hit OK there. I'm going to get a couple licensing messages. That's free. You can just ignore those. Okay, so since everyone is fairly new to accounts receivable, I am going to spend a little bit more time on this setup than I normally would. This is a transaction processing class, but I would like to review some of the setup here before we get rolling. So if we go into the setup, to start using accounts receivable, I'll say to its fullest, there is a fair bit about a setup that needs to be done depending how you want to use accounts receivable. So if we go into options here quickly, I'll just quickly highlight some of the different settings here. One of them is this process of reoccurring charges. So if you have any type of monthly, let's say funding or invoicing that needs to be done, here is where you would turn that on and start using it. So I'm going to turn that on. I'm going to turn off retainage accounting because that's more a construction industry specific setting where you invoice your customers and then there's a holdback basically until the project is finished. And then there's some various statistics settings and whatnot when you want to look up customer statistics. If you go to the transaction tab, there's some defaults in here that when we go and start doing transactions, it'll default to these settings. So these, of course, are customizable. So depending on how you decide to use accounts receivable, you may want to come into these settings and tweak them to fit how you're going to use accounts receivable. You'll see when we go do processing, there's two invoice types. You can do an item invoice. So think of that as like an inventory. So if you sell inventory, you can set up items and then call up those items to basically sell them. Now you don't actually have to have physical inventory, but you can have items that you may sell that you can call up on a reoccurring basis. There's also summary type invoices where you just go ahead and put in summary text, etc., and just a dollar value. So we'll go through both of those types. But for now, I'm going to leave it at item. And then there's some defaults. I'll just leave as is. And then there's when you do a receipt. So when you receive cash, what type of transaction do you want to default to? So there's really main two types. There's the receipt, which is a receipt of an invoice already paid, or sorry, not already paid, already entered. So if you think of that in relation to accounts payable, it is where you've entered the invoice and then you go and pay it kind of in 2 steps. So this would be the equivalent of that. You would enter the invoice and post it, and then at some later time, then receive the funds of that invoice. The miscellaneous receipt option is the other second most common type, where you have the receipt and you just want to go and record it, the receipt and the invoice all in one step. So that is very common if you're going to record, let's say, funding that is coming into your bank, regularly every beginning of every month or whatever the case may be, or miscellaneous type receipts for, maybe you sell some office furniture or something to an employee and they just give you, I'll say, $20 cash or something. Those types of receipts are generally entered as just miscellaneous type receipts. But we'll discuss the difference there in a little bit more detail. Then there's some defaults. Another big one, is this default bank code. So when you go and do a deposit, it's going to default to a certain bank. Of course, you can always change it, but here's where you set up the default. I may come back to some of these other settings here when applicable, but for now, I'll just pop over to the numbering. So these numbering settings, I'm going to leave as is, but we are going to come back and change them once we see how that affects processing. For now, just make note that whenever we do anything, it's defaulting the numbering to a length of 22. And then we give it a custom prefix. For invoicing, we just called it IN, and our next invoice number is going to be 12. So IN uses 2 characters, 12 uses 2 characters, so that's 4. We told it the system that it's a length of 22, so that means the system is going to pad that with 18 zeros. So you're going to get a very long, kind of cumbersome number to work with. I'm going to show that at the start here just to show you what the number looks like, and then we're going to come in and tweak that setting. And then there's the options for when you do accounts receivable statements to a customer. So just some default dunning messages and whatnot. So that's a highlight of the main settings under our options for accounts receivable. Now, one of the other ones, or a couple of the other ones we'll want to make note of, is these interest profiles. So if you charge your customer's interest on overdue accounts, here's where you'd set that up. Now, that's not very common that people charge interest anymore, but here's where you'd set up the interest rate, the minimum amounts, etc. So that's something under periodic processing where you can go in and, oh, I'm sorry, didn't turn my cell off. Sorry about that. And then if we go and set up items, like we talked about earlier, if you're not using inventory control, but you do sell some sort of items, you can set those items up here. So we can click on there and look at different inventory not inventory items, but different AR items where the revenue is going to get recorded when you sell these items, the pricing setup, the tax setup, etc. So these can be handy to not necessarily even set up items, but almost to be a shorthand to a revenue account. And again, we'll talk about that a bit more when we actually go do some invoicing. And I'm going to come back and talk about the GL integration setting too once we do some transactions. So any questions about any of these other setup items that I've kind of quickly went over? Another one that we're going to be using also is these distribution codes. We'll come back to those, but you can almost think of those again as shorthand codes to point to particular GL accounts. So instead of having to remember that, okay, I have $10,000 worth of revenue I want to record to that GL account, you can just use this distribution code, which is a shorthand way to point to these revenue accounts. Okay, so let's pop over into accounts receivable, and we're going to actually start going through the different types of transactions. So there is, if I get my drawing tool here, there is the first part here where is really invoice entry. So that's where you go in and record the fact that there's customers or entities that owe you money. So we're going to go in and record an invoice to specify that, let's say, Stonefield owes you money for some reason. Then when they pay it, we're going to go do a receipt. And there's quite a few different ways here to how to do receipts. But that's usually step 2, is where you go in and record the receipt of the funds that we recorded as an invoice or we did as a miscellaneous payment. We can also do adjustments. Those are fairly rare, where you go in and you make an entry and maybe for whatever reason we recorded it incorrectly. You can go in and correct it via an adjustment batch. And if you ever have to refund a customer for any reason, you can basically do checks right out of accounts receivable, checks to your customers. And you do that through the refund batch list. And then there's just a nice document inquiry icon here where you want to go in and look at past invoices and or receipts. Now, let me just erase this here. Now, for those of you that are new to accounts receivable, I just want to diagram out here real quick in my little chicken scratch here how your AR kind of connects with the rest of the program. So most of you are probably using accounts payable. So that's another module in Sage. So as you probably know, Sage is made up of the different modules for you to turn on based on what type of transactions you want to do in the system. So this is accounts payable, which of course you use to pay your vendors or make any type of payments generally going out of the system. Accounts receivable sits over here, really basically the opposite of accounts payable. So this records money going out, and then this records money coming in. These transactions then both feed bank services. So bank services sits over here. Oh, my drawing is getting worse as I go here. So when you do a transaction in AR, a receipt transaction in AR, it flows over the deposit information over into bank services. When you do a check in AP, it flows over the check information into bank services. Then, because you got now all your accounts receivable transactions, all your money coming in entered through AR, all your money going out entered through AP, you can then do your bank reconciliation here in bank services, and then any transactions from there that need to go to the GL will go to the GL. What that means then is you have to do very few transactions here up in the GL. Almost everything should be entered through AP, money going out, AR, money coming in, In bank services, you can do entries to record miscellaneous type transactions going in and out of your bank, and then everything flows to the GL. So for those of you who might be recording revenue directly in your GL, you'll want to stop that and start doing it through AR. If you're doing it through the GL, that then also probably tells me that you're doing manual bank reconciliations, which, you know, is obviously is probably working for you, but there's a much easier way to do it right through bank services. If I can just ask a quick question here of everyone, who currently is recording their revenue in the general ledger and doing their bank recs, I'll say manually in the GL? Don't be shy. Everyone's a little shy. That's fine. So that's going to be our goal today, is how to enter transactions here in accounts receivable so that they feed bank services, record our revenue, allows us to do our bank reconciliations, and speeds up our daily processing. Okay, so let's start off with an invoice. So we're going to go into our invoice batch list, and we're going to click on New to start a new batch. So here's a new invoice batch. So we're going to call this June 30th invoices. The batch date's going to default to June 30th. Our entry number is entry 1. Again, we can't control these numbers in any way. The system just assigns them. Now, here we talked about the two different types of invoices. So we can select each entry which type of invoice this is going to be. So we're going to start with an item. And we're going to call this, we'll just call it sale of items. This is a description field for this invoice. It's not a mandatory field. You can choose whether you want to put anything into that field or not. I'm going to show later on how to customize these screens, because as an organization, you may decide that, okay, we're not going to use these fields, or we are, and this is the information we're going to put in there. So it's usually a good idea to have some kind of organization standard or company standard on what you're going to use these fields for, what information you're going to put in them, if any, and whether you even want to have that field on the screen. So in our organization here, we're going to say that this field we're going to use for just a general description of the invoice. I'm just making a note here so I don't forget to cover that. Then we pick the customer. So we can click on our Finder and look at the list of customers we have in the system. I am just going to pick kind of random here, this Acme Plumbing. Now an invoice has to be recorded against the customer. So if that customer or the person you want to bill or the organization you want to bill, it doesn't exist, you have to go and add that into the system before you can do an invoice. You'll see later we can actually do miscellaneous receipts to non-customers, but we can't do an invoice to non-customers. There's a couple items here that you can use. If the customer doesn't exist, you can actually add them on the fly by hitting this plus key by customer number. If you click on that, it'll come up with our customer screen where we can go in and add a new customer on the fly. In this case, I've already selected customer 1210, so it comes up with the 1210 record. If I wouldn't have selected a customer, this would come up blank and we can add a customer on the fly. because we've added that customer already, we can now go in here and change their profile if we want. So say, for example, they had a notice that they moved or that their phone number is changed or something to that effect. We can actually then come in here, and as we're adding the invoice, we can go in and edit their profile information. And you also can click on this zoom button, and that's going to pop up with an inquiry area where you can go in and look at all the history for that particular customer. Now, I know we have at least one person here that is actually using the inventory and order entry system, which we do have set up in our sample company here. But the only thing that really changes as far as this accounts receivable processing is generally your invoices aren't going to be directly entered into accounts receivable. They're going to originate from order entry and flow up into invoice entry. So getting back to our inquiry screen here. So when we click that drill down button, we get this customer inquiry that will tell us pretty much anything we need to know in regards to this customer. We can go in and look at their profile, their address, right? What their tax setup is. Are they over or under their credit limit? Different comments we may put in for the customer. The documents tab is a big one. Here's where you can go in and look at or do inquiries on old invoices. So if we have any questions about any of these invoices, we can just click on our drill down button and it'll actually open up the document information so that we can look at it, see where it originated from, where it was coded, all that sort of information. We can also reprint the invoices from here, etc. So if you're working with accounts receivable and you do a lot of invoicing, and receipts for that matter, you're going to come in here quite a bit. A lot of people that are working in AR, a lot, they just open this window first thing in the morning and they just leave that window open all day because they're in and out of there a lot. I'm going to close that off and just continue on with our invoice. So if you have different ship to locations, so you might have a customer that their head office is in Saskatoon, but you ship to a whole bunch of different locations throughout the city or throughout the province or wherever. You can set up different ship tos so that when you invoice them and process orders, etc. for them, you can put in where the product is going to be shipped to or has been shipped. The document types, invoice, of course, is the most common. You can also do credit notes. You can also do debit notes, although those are usually fairly rare. The main two types will be invoice when you want to just directly invoice someone, and then usually a credit note is when you want to write off an invoice, write off a short payment, etc. So we'll go through over those two types. Then there's our document date, defaulting to our session date. We'll just leave that as is. The document number, you're going to leave at new. Now, you can put your own document number in there if you want, although I suggest just letting the system generate the next number. If you ever happen to overwrite that document number by accident, you have to kind of start the entry over to have the system generate the next number. Otherwise, excuse me, otherwise it is going to use whatever you typed into this field as the document number. So I've had clients that they accidentally type over this new and then they just type in star, 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 new, star, 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 thinking that the system will generate a new number. It doesn't. It actually uses that as the document number. Then there's a PO number field. So if you got a PO number from your customer, you can put that in. There's also an order number. There's a special instructions field. There's a shipment number, a ship via field, and a ship via description field. Now, not every organization is going to use these fields. So what I want to do is just take a minute here now and show you how you can customize this screen. So this process can be used all throughout the system. Almost any screen you pop up with in Sage gives you the ability to customize it for your organization. So all you have to do is you just go into File, Customize. You have to create a profile. I have one here already just called Training. And if I just drag this over, all the fields that appear on this screen will be on our list here. So all we have to do is just go through and decide which fields we're going to use and which ones we're not. Account set is always a good example. We have to tab through that all the time, but nobody ever changes that and probably shouldn't ever change it. All you have to do is just click, find that field, and turn it off, and you'll see it disappears from the screen. So it saves some keystrokes. We don't have to constantly be going through it. There's also the shipment number field. So if you're not using the shipment number field, you can turn that off. If we scroll down, let's find a few other fields here. Invoice description. So I mentioned that earlier. That's this field up here. If you decide as an organization you're not going to use it, you can just turn it off and you can skip through that field. Ship tos are something that if you're using accounts receivable directly, you generally don't have a lot of ship tos, so you can turn those off also. And you can see we're starting to clean up the screen quite nicely. We can then go in and say, yeah, you know, we don't use the job related field. We can turn that off, etc., etc. So you can see how we can clean up the screen depending on the fields we're going to use as our organization or in our organization. You can also then decide via security settings who is going to see the screen this way. So you might have supervisors that, let's say, want to see every screen or every field on the screen, but your data entry people don't necessarily want to see all those fields because it slows down their data entry. So I'm going to cancel that so we can see all the fields, but just keep in mind that that's available. And I would suggest using it because I know it's just a few keystrokes, but over time those add up, and you can be much more efficient by cleaning up these different screens. The same goes said for all the fields down below here. So you can put these in whatever order you'd like. You can change the order. You can hide certain fields. Let's say we decide we're never going to use the comment field. We can hide that. I'm going to restore the comment field. If we don't use optional fields in our accounts receivable, you can just hide that. Export declaration, usually you don't need that. We can hide that, etc. and clean up this data entry area. So again, it makes your life as easy as possible. So we're going to go and pick an item now. So we're going to go and pick an item from our list. And these are the items we set up under our setup. I'm just going to say that we're selling RG59 cable. So I just call up that item number. There's a unit of measure we can use. So we have two options for this item. We can sell it by the foot or the spool. I'm just going to sell it by the foot here. Then I got to tell it how many feet. So I'm going to say we're buying 500 feet of this cable. There's a comment field there. I'm going to leave that blank and we'll come back to that. There's our default price that we're selling this cable for. We can just accept that. It does an extended amount. Also shows us a cost of that item because we put in a cost when we set up this item. So we can kind of see our profit on this. We're selling it for $470 and it cost us $205, so we're making approximately $265. This distribution code setting tells us which revenue and expense accounts to send it to. So if for whatever reason we want to have it go to a different revenue account than is set up, we can change the different distribution codes here. All right, so let's hit add here. And because I have my auto clear setting on, it automatically takes me to entry 2. If I go to settings, and look, there's an auto clear mode, I have it checked off. So what that means is every time I hit add, it's going to automatically clear my screen and take me to the next entry. For the training here today, I'm going to turn that off. So when I hit add, it stays on the entry I was working on. So I'm just going to go back to entry 1. Notice the big document number that it created for us. A very cumbersome number probably to work with. We don't want to show our customers, a big number like that. So we're going to go back and change those settings. We're going to now go and print the invoice. And that's a default form I'm going to use. I just want to go to use the default AR invoice form. If I can find it here. So these are customizable forms, so we can customize your invoice, to make it look whatever you'd like. Sorry, just give me a second here to find that. Oh, there we go. And then hit print. Notice our delivery method is the print destination. I'll talk about that in a second. So this is what the default invoice looks like. So we've got the item number, description, quantities, prices, etc. Pretty standard looking invoice. And like I said, we can customize this however you'd like, put your logo on, all that sort of stuff. I'm going to hit close here. And now that we've printed it, maybe we found some errors on there or we want to change something on the invoice. Because we haven't posted it yet, of course, we can still edit this. So I'm going to go in, I'm going to put a comment in here now. So I'm just going to put something to the effect of, as requested by customer, please ship in bubble wrap. Now, we can put the comment so it shows up on this screen for anybody that's looking at this. And then we can choose whether they're printed or not. So we can say yes or no to print that comment on the invoice. I generally like to have that field right in front of the comment field. So I can say yes or no, I want to print it, and then type in what my comment is going to be. But again, you can customize that for how you prefer to do your data entry. I'm going to save that and just hit reprint. And now you'll see there's a comment on here. So we're going to hit close there. And then close here. So I'm going to do another item or another invoice in this batch. This time it's going to be a summary invoice. So once I click on summary, you'll see this bottom part is going to change. And I think for most of you in the class here, these are the types of invoices you're going to be doing. And really all you're going to do there is you're just going to put the revenue account that you want this invoice to go to and really the amount. And then if you're printing these invoices and sending them to the customer, you'll put probably a description field in here, etc. Now, before I go and do this next entry and add it, I want to go in and tweak these settings. Specifically the numbers settings, where we're going to go into our options, go to numbering, and we're going to change our invoice numbering to 8. And actually, while we're in here, I'm going to change them all to 8. And I'm going to go back to my invoice batch list. And I'm going to add another type of invoice. I'm going to add it to the same customer, 1210. So I'm going to click on new. Again, my default's item because that's what I set up in my options. It's going to be a summary invoice. And I'm just going to say record. Actually, I'm going to call this record monthly funding. So I want to record some automatic funding that's getting deposited into my account, let's say at the first of every month. So it's coming from 1210. So that's all I'm doing there is this, where is this money coming from? I know a lot of you are working with First Nations organizations, so that might be ISC to record your monthly funding from ISC, or other customers that you may be billing maybe internally or whatever the case may be. Ship to location wouldn't be applicable. We're just going to tab through that. Invoice number we're going to leave as, or sorry, the invoice date we're going to leave as the 30th. Our document number is going to be new, and we're going to just tab through all these other fields and go down to the bottom and go over to my revenue account. So my revenue accounts are in the 4,000, so I'm just going to go to 4,000. If I start typing that in and then click the finder, it'll jump right to the 4,000 accounts. I'm going to say this is sales, I'll say accessories for that department in that region, as that's how my sample company is set up. And then I can just put in, let's say $25,000. And I also need to code some other revenue to some other GL accounts. So I'm going to go in and just put it to this GL account, and this is going to be, let's say, $65,000. And then I'm just going to hit add. And if I want to print this invoice, I just go print invoice. And you'll see this is going to look a lot different than the other invoice because it's not an item invoice. So a lot of these columns are blank. So a lot of times for customers, if they are always one or the other, fairly easy. If they're always doing summary, we customize this quite a bit to get rid of all these columns that are always going to be blank. We get rid of this due date information, that sort of stuff. In this case, we generally would want to put some type of description in here, especially if we're actually going to print it for our records or anything like that. I'm going to go in and put a description in here, and we're just going to call this monthly funding. Monthly funding, let's say post-secondary. Save that and reprint it. And now you can see that, of course, the descriptions now show up. So let's hit close there. And hit close. And I'm going to go post this batch here. Now, keep in mind, in accounts receivable, when you record the invoice, that doesn't record anything cash related. So it's not affecting our bank reconciliation or our bank services in any way. All we're doing is recording that this customer owes us this money. One of the nice things you may find about entering AR invoices is if you have to invoice out or record monthly revenue agreements or funding agreements, you can set these up as reoccurring charges. So a lot of times we'll have clients that get monthly auto deposits, and it has to get coded to like 20 different GL accounts. So instead of having to enter that in every month, we create a reoccurring charge that automatically allocates that out to all the different revenue accounts. And then we can go in and edit these amounts because they may change from month to month. But at least a lot of the data entry is done for us. We still have to go in and record the receipt or the actual money coming into our bank account. And that's a separate step. The miscellaneous receipt we're going to talk about is doing all this in one step. The drawback of doing it that way is that we have to key that whole entry in every time. Whereas using the invoice and then the receipt function, right, can save some of that data entry time, although it's 2 steps. So pros and cons to doing it either way. So I'm going to save and post this batch. We're going to hit close. If we go to entry 2, you can see the difference between the document numbering for our second entry and our first, right, just by tweaking those settings. Sorry, was there a question? No? Okay. So let's continue on kind of to the next step now, which is receiving the funds into our bank account. So we're going to go into receipt batch, and we're going to click on new. And we're going to call this June 30th deposit. So we give it a batch date. All that does is controls the defaults for the rest of this batch. When you're doing receipts, it's very important to make sure that we have all these dates correct, because this is going to affect when this deposit shows up in our bank reconciliation. So I get this issue quite a bit. Clients calling in that, oh, I'm doing my bank rec, but I don't see my deposit. I know I've entered it, I can see it, but the issue is they're doing their June 30th bank rec, but they accidentally recorded their deposit as, let's say, July 1st. So it'll show up on their bank statement as June 30th, but it doesn't show up in bank services till July. So we've created an issue there for ourselves just by not having the correct dates entered. Again, I see this lots for people who are, let's say, going back and entering their deposits for the last couple months. They forget change the dates, so it's not showing up in the proper month for their bank rec. So then all I do is you pick the bank that this is getting deposited into. If you have multiple bank accounts, then of course you just pick from the list. Then we have to give it a deposit number. So we're going to click on new there, and the system's just going to generate a deposit number, and very importantly, a deposit date. So I really want everyone to make note of that, because that's when the deposit's going to show up on bank services. So a big reason people start using accounts receivable is for that exact reason. They want to start doing their bank reconciliations through bank services. Therefore, they have to record all their deposits in accounts receivable. And then that, therefore, has to make sure that our deposit date is correct. Now, not only that, we also have to make sure that our total amount is also correct. Because what's going to happen is we're going to go in and enter a receipt. It might be multiple checks or multiple receipts within this batch, but this total, you're going to want to match what shows up on your bank statement, because that's going to make your bank reconciliations a lot easier. Some clients, I know what they do is they enter in all the deposits for the month in one great big batch, which the end result's the same, but it makes their bank recs a lot harder because they have one great big deposit showing up in bank services, but on their actual bank statement, there might be 10 or 15 deposits that they've lumped together. So it makes the bank reconciliation a lot harder. So what we want to get out of all that is every deposit in your bank, you should have its own receipt batch. And then the date should be exactly the date it's going into your bank, and should be the exact amount. And that'll make your life much easier when you go to do your bank reconciliation. Okay, so we're going to go in, same kind of process as entering an invoice here. We're going to, entry number 1 automatically signs that for us. We're going to give a description of this receipt now. So this one we're just going to call received on account. Now the transaction type from our setup is defaulting to miscellaneous receipt. We want to change that to receipt now. Again, the difference being receipt, the invoice already exists in the system. For a miscellaneous receipt, we're recording the invoice and the receipt all at the same time. So we're going to click on receipt. For our customer number, we're going to pick 1210. We can put in a reference in here if we want. I find most people don't use the reference field when they're doing a receipt entry, so we could just hide that field or tab through it. Account set, we don't change. The payment code, so this is how did we receive these funds. So if we click into our Finder, we see that we have a few different types. So you can create these different types in the setup. So we have, of course, check, cash, some credit cards here, and then wire transfers. So in this particular case, I'm just going to say check, and then we have to give it a check number. So we're going to just type in 654321. Then we have to tell it how much did we receive. So in this case, for now, I'm just going to put that to $50,000. Now, because this is a receipt, we then have to hit this go button. And what this go button will do is bring in all the invoices that are due from this customer. So if I hit my go button here, there's lots of different invoices from this customer that are overdue. Now, I'm just going to set this back to 0 here for a second because I just want to plug that number here. So if we look at their check advice, we would see that, okay, yes, they've paid this invoice, and we just check it off. It's going to default to have paid the whole invoice. Then we're going to go and say, yeah, they've paid that one too, and that one too. So it automatically defaults to apply the full amount of the invoice. So we can see that if this in fact was what they all paid, the receipt amount would be $1,900, $1,963.29 because we can see that that's the unapplied amount. So what we would have done first of all is just typed in 1963.29 in here, and our receipt unapplied would go to 0. Now, if you would ever, let's say they sent you a check of $2,000, and the difference of these 3 invoices and the $2,000, the $37.81, would sit on their account as unapplied cash. And then we would have to go and apply it later. That's fairly rare, but that would be the process. And all we have to do now is just hit add. Notice our total amount over here changes. So in this deposit, I'm going to say I also got a check from someone else. So I'm going to put in received on account. I'm going to go to receipt, pick my customer that I got the check from. This time I'm going to pick Ronald Black because I know he'll have some outstanding invoices. And I put in his information. So he sent me a check for $15.26, or sorry, the check number was $15.26. The receipt amount is, in this case, I'm going to say $5,000. I click on my go button, and now it'll bring in all the transactions that are outstanding for that customer. So I'm just going to go through and pick some invoices here. Again, notice it's defaulting to pay everything. So I'm just going to randomly pick a few of the invoices. Notice now that they sent me the check for $5,000. I've applied it to some of the invoices from pay advice, but now there's this 301.26 that I don't know what it's for. So I'm just going to leave that on their account as unapplied cash. And then I'll go through the process to apply that later. So now you'll see my total deposit amount has gone up appropriately. So I'm also going to enter in the type of transaction I talked about earlier, where it's just a sale of some furniture to an employee that wanted, let's say, one of our old chairs. So now this would be a miscellaneous receipt. So if we click on our Finder, if we have them set up as a customer in the system, we can just pick them from the list. So I'm going to say this was Dan here. In our reference field, we're now going to use this. We're going to call this sale of office chair. His default code is set to Visa, but we're going to say in this case that he's actually just gave us 20 bucks cash. So we're going to go cash. Obviously, there's no check number or receipt number, so we're going to tab through that. Invoice number, we're just going to let the system generate it. We're not going to give them an invoice, but the system needs an invoice number, so we're just going to let it generate it. We put in $20 here. And now we just go through and code this to a GL account. So you notice this is much different than when we do a receipt, because now we're not telling it it's paying a bunch of invoices. It's just going to a GL account. So same thing, I'm going to go to a revenue account. Let's just say I think we have some miscellaneous there. So we're going to go miscellaneous income, $20. Now it calculated some taxes for me. I'm just going to zero those out. Now that's because this customer had default tax turned on. Normally for an employee or particular customers, depending on their tax scenario, you would have that set up appropriately in their profile. So we're just going to add that. So now we can click add. So 3 different types of receipts in here in this batch. Again, the important thing is this total is going to match the amount that shows up on your bank statement. You can actually print a deposit slip from here if you click on the deposit slip and then hit print. This will print off your kind of traditional looking bank statement, or sorry, bank deposit slip. We received $20 in cash. We received a couple checks. We go to the next page. We can put in the layout and actually take this to the bank so we don't have to record or handwrite our deposit books anymore. This will actually create a deposit slip for us that we can take to the bank. Now, usually the bank likes to have, let's say your account information on here, the date, etc. They'd like to have this customized in a certain way. So internally here at Stonefield, we use this all the time, but we did have to take this report and customize it a bit so our bank would accept it. So that's something you may need to do for yourselves also. So that's the deposit slip when we're actually taking a deposit to the bank. Now, if we go back to entry 3, we can also print a receipt. So let's say that Dan wanted a receipt for this $20 so he can show that he paid for it. So all we have to do here is for that particular entry is just go print receipt and then hit print, and it'll spit out a receipt for us that we can then give to Dan. So again, this is just another one of the reports that we can customize however you'd like. Let's hit close there. Close. We get a little warning here that says a receipt has been printed for entry 3. The option to allow edit after receipt is not selected in AR options. So now we can only view the transaction. We can't change it anymore. So it's a little bit of a security feature there that once we've given the receipt to Dan, we can't come in here and change it after the receipt has been issued. So let's hit close here. And now we're going to post this batch. So let's hit post. You may want to make note of that number, 6,900 and change. We hit post. It posts this batch. Now, once it posts the batch, we can hit close here. And now, if we go and start doing our June bank reconciliation, we're going to go over to bank services, which is under common services, then bank services, bank transactions, and we're going to start reconciling our statement for June. I'm going to say June 30th bank reconciliation. We're going to put in our statement date as of June 30th and our reconciliation date of June 30th. This isn't a bank reconciliation class, but I do want to just note here that the dates you put in here, this is going to show you all transactions that have been entered into the system as of this date. So when we go over to the reconciliation tab here and start clearing transactions, it's only going to show us transactions as of that date. So that's why I emphasize the deposit date, because if you accidentally, or if you were signed in as July, you forgot to change the deposit date, that deposit here will no longer show up. So now when we go to the reconciliation tab, here's all the transactions that are outstanding for our bank. If we scroll through now to the end, we'll see our deposit for $6,983.29. And we'll be able to do our bank reconciliation. So that is a big, big reason why a lot of people will implement accounts receivable. Not necessarily because they have to manage their receivables, but to record their revenue coming in. Especially if you're a nonprofit or someone that's actually not invoicing people, you're just recording money coming in. You record it as a receipt batch. And then you can choose whether to do invoices first or not. So I'm going to do another, this time I'll say a June, or actually let's say, well, we'll do a July 1st deposit now. Before I go and do that, any questions on that process? Because that's a quick overview generally of the process. You enter invoices, go do a receipt batch, shows up in bank services. You can reconcile your bank and away you go. Any questions from anybody on that? Nobody?
So
Okay.
you'd first enter the receipt?
Well, generally, if you're doing an invoice, you enter the invoice first, right? If you're actually...
I meant invoice, yes.
That's right. Yeah. You would enter the invoice first because the invoice has to exist before you can do a receipt against that invoices.
Right.
Now, again, you don't have to do invoices, right? You can skip that step and go right to receipt batch list, right? And there is pros and cons to doing both. I'm going to go in and do a quick receipt batch now for some monthly funding that we get. So I'm going to click on new. And I'm going to just start a July, I'm going to call this July 2021 or 2020 funding. Our batch date, again, is important. We're going to go July 1st to that bank account. We're going to give it a deposit number, and that's going to generate our deposit date. So I'm going to call this ISC funding. It's going to be a miscellaneous receipt, right? Because I haven't done an invoice for it. My customer number, I would have to pick from my list. Now, because this is a miscellaneous receipt, I could completely skip that step and just type in directly who it was. I can just say ISC. We can put a reference in if we want. A lot of times ISC will give you a statement. You can put in their reference number. And I'll just make one up there. They're paying, now they don't generally pay by check. They of course do it by direct deposit. So I'm going to say wire transfer is their payment method. Notice I'm skipping through the receipt check number. We'll come back to that in a second. Remember, we have to have an invoice number. So we're going to go in and just let the system generate that invoice number. Again, a lot of times ISC, they actually have an invoice number on their documentation. So you could just type that in there if you want.
Hi, Renee, I just got a quick question. Sorry.
Yeah, you betcha.
So for our little session this afternoon, this is basically touching up on, this is where I would go to enter my deposits from my bank statement, right?
Exactly.
Okay, and then for everyone, you just create new.
That's right. Exactly. Yeah,
on
that's
the deposit
exactly right.
day. Okay, all right.
Yeah.
I'm just getting a refresher. Sorry about that.
No, that's all right. Please, anybody that has any questions, please feel free to speak out, because those are always the best classes, is when we get some interaction with the participants. Otherwise, it's boring for me to sit here and talk for 3 hours, and probably boring for you to listen to me for 3 hours. It's great if we get questions to address your particular concerns. So Stacy, yeah, that's kind of why I wanted or suggested you sit in on this class, because really this is exactly what we're going to do, is go in and enter these sorts of deposits. So in this
Right.
case, yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, you betcha. So in this case, the receipt amount here is, let's say, 735,000. So we're going to tab through here. And really, no matter what the amount is, here's now where we're going to code that so it shows up properly for the different program revenue or the different funding agreements, etc. So now we just go and pick our revenue accounts where they need to go. So I'm just going to pick a few at random. This sample company is all about sales and whatnot. Depending on your organization, it might be just the ISC funding and then the department code, etc. I'm just going to pick a few at random here. So we're going to say 58,000, and then 4010, 110, 135,000. Notice this undistributed amount is coming down as we enter information. Now here is where you can see some of the advantages of maybe entering it as an invoice first. Because now every month comes around, I have to sit down and code this all. Whereas if we had that set up as a reoccurring invoice, and I'll set one of those up later, we could just apply it to the invoice and all this revenue gets recorded when the invoice gets done. So we're going to add some more lines in here. Oops, I meant to go 320,000. Oops. And I'm just making up some numbers here. And I'll just do the difference here. So again, depending on your organization, this might be a fairly big entry, right? I've seen it where there could be 20 to 50 lines. So let's hit add here. And in this case, we're recording our monthly funding of $735,000. So there's no other entries we need to make. It's just one entry for the total and we've coded it out. Notice we didn't put in a check or receipt number. So the system generated one for us. And really all it is just the batch number, 39, and then dash the entry number. So let's just hit save. Probably, of course, no reason to print a deposit or a receipt. We just hit close. There's our July 2020 funding deposit. We hit post. And that records our deposit. And in this case, our auto deposit. Now, if we go over to bank services, we go to bank transactions, reconcile statements. We're in the middle of reconciling June. So as you'd expect, we go to the reconciliation tab, go down to the end. We see our June 30th deposit, but not our July 30 or our July 1st one, because our cutoff date for our bank rec was June 30th. If I just pop forward a month, and I'm going to say to July 31st, and if I hit save, now when I go to the reconciliation and start reconciling for July, I am going to see, I go to the month proper, you can see it's sorted by date. So I have to go to July 1st, and there's my deposit of 735,000, which of course I didn't see when I was doing it as of June. So again, those dates are very important, especially when it comes to deposits, because like I said, I see this all the time. People just forget to change the date. The deposit ends up getting recorded to the wrong month, and then it makes their reconciliation process a lot tougher. Let me just change that back to June. And of course, now if I go and show only deposits, I won't see that anymore. Just my June one. Okay, any questions about entering those miscellaneous receipts? So generally what'll happen is you'll have all sorts of mixtures of those different types of transactions. You'll have some auto deposits that come in, whether they're EFT or wire. You'll have some combination
Hello.
of checks that you have to enter. Hello?
Hi, sorry about that. I was trying to unmute myself.
Oh, okay.
Um, okay, so I see in the we've seen the process of where you were entering the deposits in.
Mhm.
Apparently you can scan and submit your deposits into Sage. How do you do that?
Well, I think what you're talking, Stacy, there is for PBCN. What they have is, and I don't have it set up on my training machine here, but
Oh,
what
okay.
but what they have is when you go into AR transactions and into receipt batch, what you're able to do, if we open up this batch, is you'll have another window that pops up that allows you to scan the receipt details. So let's say you
Okay.
got your ISC funding receipt for these amounts. You can
Mm-hmm.
attach that to this transaction. So you basically scan the document that you want to attach and attach it to this transaction. Now that,
Oh, okay.
yeah, and that's really all it does. It doesn't automatically record the entry or anything like that. All you're doing is attaching supporting documentation to this receipt. And that
Okay, thank
that
you.
yeah, that function you can use again if all throughout the system. A lot of people really like that for accounts payable because what that allows them to do is in accounts payable, they enter an invoice and then they can just attach the invoice to the transaction. So if anybody ever looks at that transactions, they can just double click and see the invoice right attached right to that receipt entry or payment
And
entry.
you can do that in AP as well, right? Yeah?
That's right. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank
And I
you.
believe we have that configured for you uh, for both AR and AP. But it doesn't change the process per se. You have to enter everything, you just attach the document.
Yeah.
Okay, let's hit close there. Now I want to go show now how to set up a reoccurring charge. So like we saw in this July 20th one, we have to code this all the time to a bunch of different revenue accounts. So I don't want to have to do that every month. What I want to be able to do is set up this as a reoccurring entry, and it's going to be a reoccurring invoice where I go in and have this generate automatically for me. And then I can just come in here and do the receipt kind of quickly and easily. So I'm going to use this same scenario where it's going to be our August funding that comes in. I'm going to set it up as a reoccurring invoice that is going to automatically code this. And then I can go in and just do a quick receipt one to record the money coming in. So let's go and do that. So if we go into AR customers, okay, so if you don't see the reoccurring charge icon, if you remember, we just turned it on when I went through the options, and I don't see my icon. That's because I actually have to open up my company again and basically refresh it, and then that icon will show up. So we can see our reoccurring charges icon here. Now, before I go do this, reoccurring charges have to be linked to a customer. So if we look at our ISC example again, I just typed in ISC before. They weren't actually set up as a customer. So let's go set them up as a customer. So we're going to click into customers. And I'm just going to set them up quickly here. So I'm just going to give them a customer number. If we look at our other customers, generally they have a number as their ID. In this case, I just want to use some letters. So I can have a mixture of numbers and letters and whatnot for our customers. I generally suggest come up with a standard and stick with that and not have a mixture like this, because it makes the searching a lot more difficult. But again, that's up to yourselves. And having said that, I'm going to do the opposite, and I'm just going to type in ISC as my customer number. So I know I'm still used to saying INAC, but it's Indigenous Services Canada, isn't it? Correct me if I'm wrong there. So we go in and we put it in a group code. So every customer has to belong to a group code. And all a group code does is put in some defaults for us. So I'm just going to randomly select here retail sales group. So if I go over to the invoicing and processing tabs, a lot of this information now is set up as defaults, and it pulls that from the group code. I can put an address in here if I want. I'm just going to go 123 Anywhere Street. I'll just call this Ottawa, Ontario, etc., etc. I'll leave that blank. We can put some contact information for this customer, put in the default processing. And again, we can tweak this. This all came in from the group code. There was no payment code set up for the group, so I'm just going to go in and I put in how do they normally pay us, and we're just going to say wire transfer. Now when we go do a transaction, it's going to default to that. The delivery method here for this customer. So when we go and generate invoices and or statements for our customers, we can have one of 3 different delivery methods. So we can just pick snail mail if we're actually going to print invoices and or statements and mail them out. Almost nobody does that anymore. Usually they email, so we can say email the customer directly. And the reason it has customer in brackets is because then it's going to email it to this email address. So we could just call this, ap@isc.com. If we change that to email contact, then it's going to email it to this address. So in this case, it could be steve@isc.com. So it's going to send it to this email address. So I'm going to say email the contact. Now in the new version that's just come out, you can actually set it up to deliver it to multiple contacts. So you could have it go to, let's say, 3 different people at a particular organization. You could say, send it to AP and send it to Steve, and it'll do both of those automatically. You can put some credit limit information in here. We can go to the invoicing tab, put in some invoicing defaults. A lot of this won't be applicable if you're doing your invoicing directly in accounts receivable, but if you're tied to an inventory system and order entry, you can put in this customer's default price list, the inventory location, the different price levels, etc., etc. We're going to need to put in a tax group. So I'm just going to put in Saskatchewan here. It's blank because that's how I set it up in Common Services. So it's not going to calculate any taxes or anything. I'm just going to hit add there. there's some optional field information that this organization is tracking. So if you haven't used optional fields or not aware of what they are, all they are is just custom fields that you can set up in accounts receivable to track any additional information that you may want. So of course, Sage can't think of every possible piece of information you may want to track for your customers. So they give you this option to create your own custom field so you can track really an unlimited number of pieces of information for each customer. So there's some statistics information, an activity tab so you can look at statistics for the year, and then a comments tab. So I'm going to go in here and actually put in a comment. So it defaults to the date entered, what the expiration date is, and that comes from our setup. So notice our setup, our expiration date was defaulted to 999, so it's like almost 3 years into the future. We have a follow-up date that can be used. We can say we need to follow up July 31st. We can have multiple comment types. So right now we don't have any setup, but some examples would be, well, let's say we have a collections call, a generic note, a customer service call, etc. And we can enter in all these types of comments on this customer record. I'm going to pick the admin user. This would be the person that's entering the note. And now I can put in quite a long comment here. So I'm going to say new agreement will be coming in August. Make sure and verify new amounts. Or it could be something like, we called customer on June 29th. He said the check was in the mail. Follow up in 2 weeks if we haven't received it. Let's hit close there. And then that's what that follow-up date is for. So in accounts receivable, there's a report that will list for you all comments with a follow-up date in such and such a range. For people that use these comments regularly, they have that report pop up automatically every morning. They print it off and then they know if there's anything they need to follow up with that day or that week or whatever criteria they put in. So let's hit save there. And then hit close. Any questions there about setting up a customer? Fairly straightforward. Again, by doing that, now we can go and set up a reoccurring charge for this customer. So we're going to go over to reoccurring charges. And we're going to set up a charge code just called M. And the customer is ISC. Now we can choose to have a schedule code or not. I generally like having a schedule code set up because then it's going to pop up for me automatically and be a prompt for me to remember to run the reoccurring charges. I can do it manually, of course, but I like to automate everything as much as possible, so I'm going to link it to a particular schedule code. Now I have a couple set up already, a monthly one. I'm going to create a new one right from scratch just so we can see the process. So I'm going to click on this new, and it's going to take me, or this Zoom, it's going to take me to the schedule code window, and I can create my new schedule. Where this window is in Common Services, Scheduling, and this schedules icon right here. So there's two ways of getting to the same place. So our schedule code, I'm going to call this one BEGMON for beginning of the month. The reminders, I can have no users be reminded, so that's basically shutting off this schedule. I can have it pop up for everyone, or I can have it pop up for just a specific user. And in this case, I just want to remind myself. So I'm going to say it's specific user and it's the admin user. How many days do I want to be reminded in advance? So this is when the schedule is going to start popping up. So I'm going to say I want to be reminded 3 days in advance. And this particular schedule is going to start August 1st. Because I've already recorded my July funding, I want this to start now in August. What's the reoccurring period? This is monthly, every 1 month on the first day of the month. Lots of different options here. If you have any other types of reoccurring transactions. Now, I'm doing this for an AR invoice. You can, of course, do this for journal entries or AP invoices or whatever the case may be. You can create one schedule called beginning of the month, and you may want to link all sorts of different types of transactions to this one schedule. So when you click process, you could have it generate your beginning of the month journal entries, maybe some accounts payable invoices that you get every month, and these AR invoices. So it's a one-time setup, and then anything that happens at the beginning of every month, you can link to this one schedule code. So I'm going to hit save there and close, and now I've linked it to that schedule code. Now the start date for this particular reoccurring invoice would be August 1st also, although it doesn't need to be. You could say, well, my schedule starts on August 1st, but this particular transaction doesn't start until, let's say, September, October. I can have an expiration date. So I could say, well, this reoccurring charge expires in a year or, a year or a month or whatever the case may be. It can be a maximum amount. So you're going to invoice this particular customer $500 a month till you hit 10,000 or whatever the case may be, or number of invoices. In this case, I'm just going to go no expiration date. The rest of this now is really just exactly like entering an invoice. The screen just looks a little different. So it asks me for an account set, whether it's job related, etc., ship vias, description. We can put in monthly funding agreement, PO numbers, instructions, etc., if we choose to use those fields. And then we go down to the detail here. And same thing as an invoice, is we now can decide whether to do an item invoice or a summary invoice. We're going to pick summary. And now we just enter the exact same stuff we entered before. I'm just going to make this up again here. 58,000. If we remember, our total monthly agreement was 735,000. So I'm just going to plunk in some numbers here. Oh. And I'll just keep this nice and small, but again, this is kind of the point of doing this, so we don't have to type all these different lines. So this goes to all these different revenue accounts. We do it once here. And now this will automatically generate for us. So what do I got here? 125. I just want to make it exactly the same. Uh, 100, 225, 310. So let's make this 425,000. Now, if my math is right, 425. Actually, I'm going to make this 10. That's 435, so the rest of this should be 700. So I'm going to make this 500, 100. Oh, geez, my math is terrible here. Sorry. Two, 3, 725, 735. Okay. So we're going to hit add there and close. So I'm going to pop back into Sage. I'm just going to stay in as June 30th. Ignore my licensing issues, and nothing pops up because, of course, it's not quite August 1st yet. And no, I won't get anything pop up until I reach July 29th. Why July 29th? Because I asked it to pop up for me 3 days ahead of the scheduled date, which is August 1st. So if I go in and open company now, and I'm going to sign in as, oh, I wonder if I set up my schedule properly as to be 2020. Let me just go have a look. I did, good. So now if I sign in as July 29th, you'll see our schedule code pops up automatically. So all I have to do is click on this now and then just hit process, and it automatically creates my invoice for me. And that's all it does. It doesn't post anything automatically or anything like that. We just go into AR now and go into my invoice batch list, and there's my reoccurring charge batch for August. And the nice part about that, like we talked about, is when I go in here now, all that coding is done for me automatically. So I don't have to rekey this every month. The system will do it for me. I can still come in here and I can edit the amounts. Right? If the funding, was really for 745,000, I can just edit this. So totals to 745,000. So let's hit save here. And now I'm going to post this. So now it posts this batch. So now this invoice is outstanding for ISC. Sorry, I'm just going to pop back in there. Again, notice everything's August 1st, so all the revenue is going to get recorded into the proper period. But this hasn't affected our bank account yet. Right? This is just recording the revenue, and the offsetting of it would be your accounts receivable control account. So the entry created is just debit to your accounts receivable, credit to your different revenue accounts. Now what we're going to need to do is go and do a receipt batch to get it into our bank account. So we're going to click on new here. And now I'm going to call this August 1st, 2020 monthly deposit. Notice it's defaulting to July 29th, right? Because that's the date I signed in as. So I got to be careful here and make sure and pick the right date of August 1st. Oops, August 1st. Correct bank account, and then when I click new, it'll automatically default to the correct deposit date. Now, this isn't a miscellaneous receipt, right? Which type is this? gold star for whoever can tell me. Who's not shy to tell me.
Prepayment.
What's that?
It's a prepayment.
No. A prepayment is for a payment that you don't have an invoice for yet. So an example of that would be, let's say we sell someone a whole bunch of office furniture and we require a $500 deposit before we'll process the order. So the customer gives us a check for $500, but we don't have any invoice or anything yet to apply it against. So we just put it to their account and we can apply it later once we invoice them. And yeah, so that's a good point. I'll actually do an example of that here.
So this is an applied document then?
No, this is actually, and that's a good point because that's a prepayment kind of leads into an applied document option. So when I do my prepayment, I'll then show you how to use the applied document function.
Okay.
And an unapplied cash is kind of almost the same. Is we get a check from a customer, but we don't really have any idea what it's for. But we want to get it deposited into the bank. So what we can do is we can just say, well, this is an unapplied cash to this customer's account, excuse me. And then we'll have to use the apply document function later to apply it to either invoices or revenue accounts once we figure out what it's for. So it's just kind of a quick way to record the receipt from the customer. We don't know what it's paying for yet. Just get it on their account and get it into the bank. So what we want to do here is this is going to just be a receipt. So the receipt is we're just recording the funds and applying them to an invoice. So it is a little confusing because we didn't really issue or get an invoice for ISC. The only reason we did the invoice part first is so we could do the coding automatically. So that first ISC deposit we did it as a miscellaneous receipt. I just go back and have a look at that. And what that made us do though is we had to do all the funding manually in here. So if we were going to do this one as August, we would have to do the same thing. We'd go miscellaneous receipt and have to code everything automatically again, or not automatically, but manually again. But what we did is we just kind of backed it all up a step and said, well, we're going to record this all as an invoice first because I can then use the reoccurring charges function to do all this for me. I don't have to do it manually. So this is how we did the July one. The August one now is we're going to do it as a receipt. Because that allows us, we just pick the customer, that allows us to go in, click our go button, and just hit yes. This is the $735,000 that you've paid us. And we hit add. And then when we post this is what's going to get it into the bank account so that when we do our August bank rec, it shows up. So there's our deposit amount, which again needs to balance exactly to what's gone into our bank account. We hit close. There is our August deposit. So we just go ahead and hit post there. So the end result of these two transactions is exactly the same. We've just done it two different ways. I'm just going to open up both screens here. So this is the July one we did as a miscellaneous receipt. We didn't have to have an invoice in the system. We basically recorded the invoice and the receipt of the cash all in one step. The drawback of that is we had to type this all in manually. Then this one we did as a receipt batch, or as a receipt transaction type, because they're both receipt batches. One's a miscellaneous receipt and one's a receipt that we apply to an existing invoice, which we did previously as an invoice batch. And then we did it that way, so it did all the coding for us automatically. Am I explaining that clearly? Does that make sense to everyone? I'll take that as a yes. So now when we go and do our bank rec, oops, wrong screen here. If we go and do our bank reconciliation, June 30th, as I showed earlier, neither of those deposits are going to be showing up. But if we go back and change this, we saw when we changed it to July, the July one shows up. If we change these dates to August, we're now doing our August bank rec. Actually, I'm going to filter it to show just deposits. If we scroll down, we're sorting by date. So there's our July one, and there's our August one. And there's our very first one we did that had multiple receipts in it. So it had checks, it had cash, etc. So this was made up of multiple transactions. These are just, of course, the one transaction. So let's hit close there. Okay. Now, we had some questions there about prepayments, applied documents. There's the unapplied cash also. But we're going to go through a scenario there where a customer gives us a deposit for an order or an invoice that hasn't been processed yet. So if we go into AR transactions, we're going to go into receipt batch list. We have to go directly into receipts because there's no invoice yet that's been done or ready to be done. So we're going to click on new. And we're going to call this, let's say, July 5th deposit. We want to make sure we pick our right date, July 5th. Give it a deposit number and date. Now this is going to be a prepayment. So this is going to be to customer, let's say to Acme again, 1210. So all we really have to do in here is we just say, okay, yeah, check. And we say the check number in this case. We'll just generate a check number for them. I'm going to put a reference here. I'm going to say deposit on desk order. And the amount's $500. Now, here's where we can have the system automatically automatically apply the document when the invoice comes in and gets posted. So we would say we can apply it to any one of these 4 types of transactions. These other 3 all are for inventory and order entry. So just for accounts receivable, it would almost always be document number. And then you could put in the document number. And then when that document number gets posted, it will automatically apply this $500 to the document. Now, in this particular case, we have no idea what the invoice number may eventually be, so we're just going to leave this all blank. And we hit add. So right now we have a deposit of $500. I'm going to keep this nice and simple and say this is the only thing in this deposit. So we're going to go ahead, we could print our deposit slip again. Right, if I go back to entry 2, here's where a good example of maybe we want to print them a receipt because he wants a record that he made this prepayment. And then there's their receipt. Now, when I did the receipt here, you may have noticed there's this delivery method. So when it's set to print destination, it's automatically going to go to whatever the print destination is currently for Sage. So generally, most people just leave this to, look on the bottom right there, to preview. Most reports will just pop up to the screen to preview, and then they can decide what they want to do with it from there. That's print destination. But a lot of people, like I said, don't really print much anymore. So they can say, I want to set it to whatever the customer setting is. So if you remember from the customer setting, we said, do we want it emailed to the main contact, to our customer contact, or we talked about also doing it to multiple contacts. And then you can have a corresponding email message. If the customer is sent to email, this will be the email message that the receipt gets sent out with, and these are customizable. So this is what the email receipt is going to look like. So, dear whoever the customer contact is, blah, 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 please find attached your receipt for your payment, da, 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 da. So we can hit close there, and that will automatically email out their receipt. Now, the nice thing about this is you can also do it for invoices. So when we did and print our invoice, you can have it automatically email out the invoice directly to the customer. And even when we do statements, if we're going to go do statements to our customers later, we can have the statement automatically look at the customer setting. If they want it snail mailed, the system will print it out. If they want it emailed, it'll automatically send out the email. Okay, let's hit close here. So we printed the receipt and sent it off to them. We get our notification again that we can no longer edit this transaction. Now there's a post button down here that when we're in batch 41, if we hit post, it'll automatically post all of batch 41. You can never post just one entry at a time. It's always going to do the whole batch. So I'm going to hit post here and post this whole batch. So there's our deposit for $500. If we now go into that customer record, so if we go into customer inquiry for customer 1200, we're going to see that prepayment on their account. So if we go to documents, it's showing all our document types and only the ones that aren't paid yet. Let me just scroll down here. So we'll see our prepayment of $500. Received it? No, that's not. Oh, I got my wrong customer. Sorry. No wonder we can't see it. It was for 1200. No, I did Acme, didn't I? Sorry, 1210. So there's our prepayment for $500. So I'm going to go in here now and process the invoice that this prepayment belongs to. So I'm going to hit close here now. And now I'm going to go do the invoice for this prepayment. And I'm just going to call this invoicing for July 29th. So So this is just like recording an invoice. So I'm going to do an item invoice this time. And I'm going to call this desks. It's for the courtyard. Or no, sorry, Acme Plumbing. Do they have a ship to? They do. So let's say we ship this to receiving dock C. It's an invoice, July 29th. We're going to let it generate the document number. They actually gave us a PO number, so we're going to put in their PO number, 125-987. We have an internal order number for them too, so let's put that in too, 09876. Special instructions. We'll put in something like ship in bubble wrap. Shipping number, well, heck, let's say we have that too. We're going to put in the tracking number. Let's say 951-951. How did we ship it? We shipped it via, let's say, cross-country trucking. So there's a lot of stuff we can track in regards to this invoice. Now, because I said item invoicing, I can go in here and say, okay, here's what we shipped. We shipped custom furniture, let's say. We can say they ordered 3 of them. Print comment, yes, I'm going to want to print the comment. And our comment is 3 custom made desks as per customer specs. $829. And let's say we also used, I'll say, some shop supplies. And we'll order 1, and let's say our standard charge is $7. We hit add, and if they have tax, it'll automatically calculate the taxes appropriately, and then we have a total invoice here. We can then print the invoice. And here's the invoice. So you can see all the different comments and stuff that I had typed in will show up on the invoice, right? The comments, how did we ship it? What's the ship to, right? So we're shipping it to the receiving dock C in Kansas City, right? The customer PO number, etc. Some of the things we put in aren't showing up, like the order number, shipment number, those sorts of things. Those, again, can be all customizable to be added to the invoice. Some of these things came in as defaults from the customer setup, like the salesperson and the term codes. We didn't put those in anywhere. Those automatically came in from the customer setup. So same thing, we can just snail mail it or use the customer settings and email it directly to them. So let's post this entry quick. All right, so if we go over to the customer account now again, and we do another inquiry. And if we go to the documents for Acme Plumbing, we can see there's their order of the desks and there's their prepayment. You'll see both of these are still sitting here as outstanding transactions. So the current balance of these transactions are still open. So if we go do a statement for this person's account, they're going to see both the total invoice and the prepayment. Now, maybe that's not what we want to show them on the statement. We want to show them that they only owe $2,199. So we're going to go in and automatically apply this $500 to this invoice, which will then show a balance due on the invoice of $21.99.76. So that is where we then go in and do a receipt batch. And let's say this one, we'll call this one July 6th deposit. Well, actually, no, I shouldn't word it like that because this isn't really going to be a deposit at all. This is just going to be an applied document, which isn't going to affect the bank account in any way. So I shouldn't call that a deposit. This batch should really be something like apply documents or clean up accounts or whatever. I'm going to call this apply documents. Now the transaction type, we can generate a deposit number in here, but there isn't really going to be a deposit. And this is going to be an apply document. So you'll see the screen changes again. We're going to pick the customer, 1210. And now what we have to do is pick the document number that we want to apply and what invoice we want to apply it to. So if we click on our finder here, it is only going to show prepayments or credit notes or something that we can apply to an invoice. So we're going to pick this prepayment of $500. We click our go button and it'll bring in all outstanding invoices for this customer, and then we just pick the invoice that we want to apply it to. So this is going to apply it to this particular invoice. We hit add and we're going to post this batch. So it's a receipt batch that doesn't record a deposit or doesn't create a deposit. And it's really a zero transactions because the system isn't creating any kind of accounting entries for us. All it's doing is taking that $500 and applying it to that invoice. Now, if we go in and again, look at their customer account, as you'd expect, we go in there now, and if we go to documents, we no longer see that prepayment because it's cleared from the system and has been applied to this invoice, which leaves an outstanding balance of that. So now we're going to say this customer actually sends us in the check now. So they paid, and we're going to say they paid $21.99.70, which is going to leave a 6-cent balance on their or on this transaction. And then I want to show you how we can do some automatic write-offs. Now, if we look down here, this bottom area will show you all the details of this particular transactions. Notice that screen will change depending on the transaction we highlight. If we go back down to this invoice, we can see, okay, this invoice was originally for $26.99.76, and here's what they bought. Here's where it got coded to, and here's all the transactions that got applied to it. So this applied says $500. This was the transaction for that $500 that it was an applied prepayment. Okay, so now let's go over and let's do the receipt for the check when it comes in. So we're going to go to AR transactions, receipt batch list. Click on new. Let's call this July 30th deposit. Change our date appropriately. create a deposit number because this is actually going to be a deposit. It's not a miscellaneous receipt because we've already got an invoice for it, so it's a receipt. July 30th for customer 1210. Check number 1589. The receipt amount here is going to be 2199.70. We're then going to hit our go button. And then there's our invoice. So we're going to say yes, where it's applied. This is the invoice they're paying. Now notice this is going to leave a balance of 6 cents on this invoice. We can do a number of things to account for that 6 cents. We could actually do an adjustment on the fly to write off that 6 cents. But in this case, I'm just going to leave it on their account so I can show you how to do a automatic write-off. So I hit add. There's the amount of our deposit. Looks good. We're going to go to the bank, so we're going to print our deposit slip. We take that off to the bank, get it deposited, and then we're going to post it. So we're going to post our deposit. All right, so let's go back and do an inquiry again. So we go to AR customers, customer inquiry. We're going to inquire on that same customer and that same transaction. So this invoice is still sitting there. It's got a balance of 6 cents now. Again, we can see what they ordered. We can see that we applied a prepayment of $500 and we also got a check for $2,199.70. We can tell what check numbers paid it, what deposit numbers they were in. So if we ever need to go back to our documentation, and we can pull up that deposit and look at the check advices or whatever else we have in our backup. Now, a big part of your accounts receivable is to be able to track everybody that owes you money, right? So we're going to go now and print some reports that will show us who owes us money, how much, how old it is, are things starting to get overdue, etc. So we're going to go to transaction reports, and we're going to go all the way over to age trial balance. So we're going to go to age trial balance. And this is the report that will list for us everybody that owes us money, how much, etc. So we're going to hit print here. And there's lots of criteria here. I won't go through it all because everyone will be just bored silly. But lots of different criteria to get the information out that we want for our report. So these are all the customers with outstanding invoices and credit notes, how much they owe us, how overdue it is, etc. If we go over now to Acme Plumbing, we can see now that they have 6 cents outstanding. Oh, okay, so we don't see that 6 cents. Do I have the right customer there? We don't see the 6 cents because of the date we generated the report as. So July 29th. So if we cut that back to, I'll just do it as of August 31st, because we did those transactions, I believe, after the 29th. We hit print. And now we'll see that 6 cents outstanding on this customer's account. So again, you can see how the dates are very important again when we're printing these reports. We did it as of July 29th. We didn't see that 6 cents because all those transactions were after July 29th. So we look at this report and we're going, I'm about to send out my statements. So I don't want that 6 cents showing up on their statement. So before I send my statements out, I want to write that amount off. And I can go through and maybe scan my receivables and see what else I might want to adjust before I send out my statements. So we can go through all this and look at it and we decide, nah, you know what, everything else is good. This 6 cents is the only one I want to write off before I do my statements. Now, AR gives you a really nice automatic way of doing this. We can go to AR periodic processing and we can do all sorts of things in here automatically. So if we didn't want to use a schedule, here's where we would go and create those reoccurring batches automatically. If we were charging our customer interest on overdue accounts, here's where you would automatically go in and create the AR interest charges for the month. But what we want to do here is we want to automatically write off that amount. We could do it manually, but again, we want to do as little as possible manually. So we're going to automatically create a write-off batch. So we're doing this as of the end of August. So we're going to go August 31st to August 31st. And we want to write off all transactions. You can do just outstanding as of certain dates. I'm going to change that to August 31st too. And I can also do it by amount. So I'm going to say anything under $1 I want. So I can do from minus 99 cents or 99. Yeah, sorry, I said $1. 99 cents to positive 99 cents. So as you may have seen, it's only going to write off that one 6 cents transaction because that's the only one we had less than $1. I can put other criteria in here on who I want to write off, what customer groups, all that sort of stuff. I'm just going to do it for everybody that has outstanding transactions less than $1. Hit process. It'll scan all my customers. It finds only the one. So now it's going to go in and it'll create for me an adjustment batch automatically. So there's my write-offs. Now we could have just as easily entered this manually. Whether we've entered it manually or automated it, the resulting entry is exactly the same. The system automatically writes it off to bad debts because that's what we told it to in our setup. And it automatically does the 6 cents. So now we can hit close. And again, just to prove to ourselves it's working the way it should, we can go in and do yet another customer inquiry. Go to that document. And it doesn't even, oh, sorry, it's still showing up here. I think I might have forgot to post that, didn't I? I did. So, sorry, we got to go post that transaction. So let's hit post there. And now when I go back to my customer inquiry, and if I refresh the screen, that transaction's gone. Because now it's been completely dealt with, it won't show up on my inquiry unless I click on the include fully paid now and hit my go button. Now it'll show me every invoice that's ever been recorded for this customer. And now I can find that transaction. The original amount was $26.99.76. I've completely applied that and it shows a balance of 0. So again, I can go down and look at all the transactions for this. I can see the original amount of the invoices. I can see that there's a $500 prepayment. There was the original, the check that then came in. They short paid it by 6 cents, so I wrote off that 6 cents. So it has a nice audit trail of everything that happened to that particular invoice. And of course, we can go through all our invoices and look at that exact same information. Most clients will have that include fully paid not turned on. And they usually sort, not by document number, but they usually do it by date and descending, so newest to oldest. But again, that's up to you. Some people like oldest to newest. Now, a lot of times clients will ask at this point, well, every time I come in here, I got to change it to the document date. I got to go descending, and I got to say whatever other criteria here. Maybe they don't want to see unapplied cash or manual checks or whatever the case may be. So they find that frustrating to have to do that every time. So any of these windows, you can always go into settings and then save settings as defaults. So every time you come into this screen now, it's going to show you everything exactly the way you asked it. So I saw I had a question come in the chat here. So let me just have a look. Okay, so Abdul, I'm not sure how to pronounce your full name there, but where else can the write-off affect apart from bad debt? Okay, so when you automatically do those write-offs, where you set the GL transaction is in here in the setup. So if we go to AR setup and we go to account sets, we'll just call up the account set here. So it will write off, I grab my pen again here, automatically to this account. So it automatically puts it to 6,100 because that is what we told it in the setup. So when you auto create it, it's going to go to that account. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't change that. If for whatever reason you want it to go somewhere else other than bad debts. Because as you recall, all it did was it created an adjustment batch for us. And we can't change it, of course, once it's posted, but before we posted it, we could have changed this account to whatever we wanted it to be. So hopefully that answers your question there. We can write off an invoice and really put it to whatever we want. So depending on the scenario, maybe you're doing a credit note to the original invoice or something to that effect. You can code it all or change it all appropriately. I still see you had one other question here. Can we make several prepayments on a single invoice? Yeah, definitely. You can go in. I showed doing one prepayment. So they did the prepayment, posted it to their account. You could do another one, post it to their account, right? And then I'll go and apply them all when they pay the difference. Now, you can also do a prepayment on the fly. So if you go in here and we do an invoice batch, I'll just do another one here real quick. just call this July 30th deposit. Oh, sorry, July 30th invoices. We'll do an item for 12, customer 1210 again. So we'll go down there and say we sold them bracket 1 at $117. So we hit add. Now they may have put a deposit down as they picked it up, or maybe they paid the whole thing. Depending on the scenario, you can just click on this prepay button and you can enter a prepayment as you're doing the invoice all in one step. So we click on a receipt batch. So this creates a new receipt batch. And let's call this sales for July 30th. Because we may have a lot of people that come in and pick stuff up and pay for it, etc. And in this case, they're paying by check, 158, and they're prepaying, let's say, $25 of it. We hit add and close. Now, because we linked the two transactions, we linked the invoice and the prepayment, because we did them together. Now, when we hit the print invoice function, that prepayment will actually show up on their invoice. So it'll show the prepayment of $25 and how much now is actually due. Whereas the way we did it earlier, it just showed them the full invoice, which is usually how clients like to see it. They want to get the full invoice. And then how much do they, well, actually, sorry, without showing the prepayment. That way they have a record of the full invoice. Now, the drawback to that, of course, is on their system now, they have to track that they already did a prepayment for $25. I see it lots where the customer forgets that they did a prepayment, or it flows through their system for the total. They pay the total, and basically now they've overpaid the invoice. And then we have to either refund them the $25 or apply to the next invoice, etc. So it can get a bit messy, but if we don't have an invoice yet, that's really the only way you can do it. If we're doing the invoice and doing the prepayment at the same time, then we can do it. But if they're putting a deposit down on an order, well, they don't have an invoice yet, so we can't apply it at the one step. So hopefully that answered your question there. Okay, so we did a lot of different types of transactions there. We wrote some stuff off, we entered invoices, we entered deposits, etc. Now it's month end and we want to send out statements to everyone that owes us money. So there's a process for that, of course. We're going to go into AR reports. Sorry, not transaction reports, but customer reports. And we can do statements, letters, and labels. So we're going to double click on statements. And we can run through the process here to just spit out and email out, hopefully email out all these different statements all in one step. So we can just say go, and I want to do it for all customers. There is two types of customers: open item, which just shows all the open items, everything that they owe. There's also balance forward type customers. So you can think of that as more of a credit card type statement. You get a beginning balance, all the current transactions, and an ending balance. And then the next month, your ending balance becomes your beginning balance, and then all the current transactions and an ending balance. So that's really the only difference between an open item and balance forward. In this case, we're going to do all customers. We're going to do it as of, let's say, August 30th or August 31st. Generally, your cutoff and run date are always the same, but there can be scenarios where you don't want it to be. And we want to age them by due date as opposed to document date. The difference between the two is if they have a term code of net 30, so our terms with them are they don't have to pay for 30 days. Well, the invoice date might be July 1st, but the actual due date is July 31st. So how do you want to age those transactions on the statement? And we'll just accept all the other defaults and hit print here. That's going to go scan all our customers and spit out statements for everyone. Oh, sorry, I see I used a statement that I had customized for a client. So yeah, again, it was a pretty simple customization. We really just put the logo on, but again, we can customize this however you want. And hopefully everyone's set to emails, so we just would print these all out and email them directly to our accounts payable contact at our customer. So we say, yes, the statement's printed successfully. And then for our open item customers, the next statement would print appropriately. Okay, we've kind of covered the whole accounts receivable cycle, I'll say. So we went in, we talked about creating customers, we entered invoices, we received payments on invoices, we did miscellaneous receipts, we did some write-offs, statements, etc. So that's generally the month-to-month process for accounts receivable. Any questions about any of that? Do you want to see any types of transactions again? I know I went through that quick. There's kind of a lots to cover, and I don't really expect anybody to remember it all. I always say the important thing is just to know what the system's all capable of. And you may not remember how to do it, but you can say, oh, I remember Rennie showing us that, in that training class. If you don't quite remember, you can just always give us a call and say, okay, remember when we did that, apply payment in AR, how do we do that again? And we can, of course, step you through that. I see we have another comment here. Oh, yes, there's a message that goes out with the email on the statement. How can you customize that email message? So yes, whenever you email out anything, you can attach certain messages for that. And if we go into our AR customers, where is that again? AR setup, email messages. So AR setup, and then we go to email messages. So here is the default message for when we send out an invoice. You can see there's also a default for when we send out a statement, a letter, and a receipt. So if we want to have a custom invoice message, we can select invoice and we can create a new message right from scratch. I'm just going to cheat a little bit and copy this. Now I want to do my message ID, we're going to say is, let's say it's custom now. And then our description will be customized email for, I'll say for Christmas time. Our email subject will be still probably something to the effect of invoice. I'm going to cheat and just copy in what I pasted there, and we can add just maybe a custom message on here to say you know, happy, oops, happy holidays, everyone, or whatever you'd like to add or customize on this message. You hit add there, and then when you go and print your statements, you can hit print. Oh, I don't have anything. Let's go to September here. And now when I go and you say no there, reprint them all so you can see if my statements didn't print properly. It's kind of the same process as a check. You can always go in and just reprint them. Oh, sorry, up here, my customer setting, and then my email message defaults to default. I can change that now to custom. Oh, I did it for invoices, sorry. So in here, I would see additional options. So I would see my custom option here, and then I could use that email template. If I go, let me go do that with invoices. If I want to reprint some invoices here. When I select customer, now I'll be able to select from the custom option that I just created. And then you can change the email message in the setup. So if you wanted to default to this, you can change it in the setup. Sorry, another thanks. Now I know that is possible. Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, that's a common one, right? So what Abdul wants to do is kind of change the wording of the message depending on the aging of the invoices. So have a little stronger worded email for the people that are overdue. Okay. Well, it looks like we might get done a little early here today. Any other questions? Any other examples of anything you'd like to see? Nothing. Everything was explained good. Well, that's great to hear. If you ever do have any other, oh, sorry, there's one other thing I wanted to show. And this is another common question we get, is if we go now to the general ledger and we go to GL transactions and we look at the different batches that got created by accounts receivable. Oh, okay. Well, first of all, we can see that we don't have our AR batches even sitting here yet. Now, if we go back to AR, there's some settings in here that we can tweak depending on how we want the system to talk to our general ledger. If you remember earlier, we talked about our general ledger being up here and accounts receivable being down here. How do these two modules talk to each other? So that's an option in the setup here where we can go in to our AR setup and go to GL integration settings. So you can see here the reason our GL transactions aren't in the general ledger yet is because we told the system that we want to do it on request. So we want to tell it when to send them to the general ledger. So now let's say it's the end of the month and we want them to flow up into the general ledger. We have to go in and periodic processing and manually go in and create GL batch. So we want to say create my invoices, receipts, adjustments, refunds, and hit process. And then that will send all the transactions up that haven't already been sent to the general ledger. Now, most people don't do it that way. They have it set to during posting. So as soon as they post into the AR, it automatically sends it to the GL. So it gives you the either option. Generally, nobody ever sets it to on request because that just gives them one extra thing they have to do at the end of the day or the month. So you can have it automatically create a new batch or create and post a new batch. So I generally suggest always create and post all at the same time. Again, so we can automate things as much as possible. If we go over into the general ledger right now, and go to GL transactions, we'll see our AR batches all sitting there now. But you'll also notice if I turn that off, none of them are posted yet. So now we've created a little bit of work for ourselves. We have to go and say, okay, yeah, that's ready to post, that's ready to post. And then go post and give it and make ourselves do yet one more step. Again, where it's much, much easier if you have this all set to happen automatically. Now, the one thing I wanted to make sure everyone's aware of is in the transactions tab here, we can customize what information we send to the general ledger when we post a transaction. So when we do an invoice, these are the settings here for what information sends to the general ledger. And why that's important is for later on when we go do GL reports, this is what we're going to see. We're going to see customer number, name, the document type, and document number. If we go and have a look here, I'm just going to slide this over. And I'm going to open up my GL batch list. And show posted. I'm going to go AR. And let's go here. Here is what gets sent to the general ledger, and it all comes back to these settings here. So we asked for the customer number, customer name, so that's what we get, customer number, customer name. Then over here we get document type, document number. There we get document type and document number. That's great if that's what we want. A lot of people want certain information to appear so that the transaction reports are much more readable. So if we go now and print a common report is the transaction listing. If we go and print it for, now let's do July. Start with our sales accounts. You can see the description we're getting. Exactly what we asked for, right? Document type, document number, customer name. Now, that might be great for this organization, but not everyone's the same. Maybe your organization wants to see something different in these reports. So maybe they want to see, when they go do an invoice, they want to see just the customer name in the reference field. Oh, it won't let me save it till I get out of all my other windows. So maybe I want to see just the customer name. I don't care about the customer number. So I'm going to hit save there. And in the detailed description, I don't want to see the document type or even the document number, let's say. I want to see the description of the invoice. And then let's hit save and close. And then let's say we want to do the same thing for the detail part, which is what would go to our revenue account. So we want to see customer name and the description field. So now I'm going to go do an invoice quick and show you the difference. I was getting an error message there. Let me just make sure that's saved properly. It didn't. Let me just tweak that again. So there's lots of different fields. So again, depending on what you want to see on the report, you can tweak this. And this goes for everywhere in the system. I see clients a lot of times cutting and pasting information from one field to another because they want it to show up. And they don't realize that they can tweak these settings, so they only have to put that information in once and not have to put it in multiple fields. So if we go over now to our AR transaction and let's do an invoice. So remember we said we wanted the description field of the invoice showing up. So we're going to say monthly funding as per agreement. And then we'll just use our ISC example again. I'll just tab through everything. There's also a description field for the detail. So we could say post-sec department. Or again, whatever we would want to show up. But keep in mind, this is the field that's going to go to the GL now. And let's just say 25,000. Okay, so I did that to account 4,000. So I posted it. Now I go to my general ledger. Because I tweaked our settings, that is automatically posted for us. Oh, that's the wrong one. Oh, did I forget to change those or save those settings? My mistake. So now we have to, here's where this is all a pain because now I have to go in and create the GL batch. Created the batch for me. And now there's my invoice sitting there. If I open it up, you'll see how the descriptions have changed. So it now just says customer number, or sorry, customer name and invoice description. So now for the readers of my reports, this is going to make much more sense for them, or even for us for that matter. I got to post that first. So you can see if I just zoom in here a little bit. So you can see how this report changes, right? these are the transactions. It sent invoice number transaction type, invoice number, customer name. Now it's just sending invoice description and customer name. Now, I always find this is a little hard to read just because every transaction takes up 2 lines. And that's because we're showing some additional information here that we may not always need. So a lot of times I'll turn off this posting sequence and batch entry, hit print, and because I do that now, every transaction will fit on 1 line, so the report is usually much easier to read. So now I know this transaction was for monthly funding as per our agreement from ISC. All this tells me is, well, this was the invoice number in Ronald Black. So if I wanted additional information, it's easy enough to get, but it may not be on this report. So if I'm sending this report to department managers or something like this, you know, they may not even have access to the system to go look at these invoices. So we're going to put better descriptions in there so they know exactly what that's for. So I just wanted to show that because that's not just an accounts receivable thing, that's all through the system, AP, etc. But I get that question quite a bit, so I just wanted to make sure I cover that. Okay, we're coming up on 12 o'clock here. Anything else before we call it a day here? Now's your chance. See if you can stump me. Nothing else? Stacy, did we cover a lot of your questions? We'll talk, I guess, shortly after lunch here, eh? Well, if there's no other questions, thanks everyone for coming. I'll end the training here. You have my contact information, so feel free to reach out to me or our tech support desk if you have any questions about accounts receivable and when you start using it yourselves. So thanks again for coming. We'll talk to everyone later.